Yeah, well, before I start, I just wanted to say thanks so much for everyone for taking the time to join, both in person and online. And also thanks so much to Klaus for the great introduction and Kaisen and Klaus for inviting us. Yeah, I've had a really great week. I really enjoyed seeing Gorka's talk, seeing Dan's talk, and I've had some really good discussions with everyone over the last few days. So thanks for that. So yeah, as per the introduction, my name is Marcus, and I'm a research fellow based at Imperial IX, which is Imperial's new institute for AI and AI in science. Yeah, my work focuses on multisensory or cross-modal integration, which is how the brain combines information from different senses, like vision, hearing, balance, and then uses that information to guide behavior. And when thinking about this process, and also for framing my talk today, I think it's really helpful to start from David Marr's 3 levels. So we'll view each level in turn. So at the computational level, we can think about the kind of tasks which multisensory processing allows animals to solve. For example, if you're a predator looking for prey in this grass and you see the grass moving to the left, what you want to determine as a predator is, has the grass moved because there's your prey hiding in the grass and it's moving left? Or is the grass moving for another reason, like the wind blowing? And integrating information from multiple modalities can help you solve that sort of task. For example, in this case, you might feel the wind blowing in the same direction as the grass, or you might be able to hear your prey making whatever prey-like noises they make in the grass. At the algorithmic level, we can then think about the kinds of algorithms which allow you to transform information from, sorry, no, I need to go somewhere else with my pointer. We can think at the algorithmic level, we can think about the functions that can map information from multiple sensory channels, like vision or hearing. I'm going to use this channel notation throughout the talk. You can always just think of them as vision and hearing, but because I'm working at this slightly abstract level, there could be information from any sense, really. So yeah, at the algorithmic level, we think about the kinds of functions, F, which can map information from multiple channels to sensory outputs or sensory decisions. And then we can also think about how well different algorithms describe animal behavior in a particular task or neural activity if you're recording from multimodal neurons. Finally, at the implementation level, we can think about how these algorithms can be implemented by hardware, which in this case is neural circuits. And we can also think about what the sort of structural constraints which we observe can tell us about algorithms which are plausible or implausible. So clearly, well, maybe not clearly, potentially there are some functions F, which it would be impossible to realize with spiking neurons. That's probably, that might be incorrect, but roughly. There's probably functions F which are more difficult to implement with spiking neurons than others. So yeah, today I'm going to talk about 2 projects which think about multisensory integration through this lens. In the first part of the talk, we're going to think about the algorithms which can implement these sorts of multisensory functions. And this is some work which is published on bioRxiv, so you can go and read the preprint if you're interested in more of the details. And then in the second part of the talk, I'm going to present some in-progress work which starts to think a bit more about multisensory architectures. But as the 2 are kind of inherently related, there will be some overlap in both parts of the talk between these 2. And though I'll try to avoid it, there might also be some confusion about the 2. But yeah, we'll roughly try and stick to this structure of covering algorithms and then architectures. Also, like I mentioned at the start, I'd rather it was more of a discussion. So if you have any questions, just ask in the middle of the talk. And also, please feel free to jump in with a question if something's just not clear. Like I'd rather you followed the talk than got confused about something, I guess. Okay, so starting with algorithms. To date, like a whole spectrum of algorithms have been proposed in the literature for how observers can combine information from multiple channels. And those are summarized really nicely in this paper by Peter Jones from UCL. And we can sort of roughly sort these algorithms into a spectrum, which roughly becomes sort of more multisensory in some ways as we progress. So at one end of the spectrum are what are called one-look algorithms, which just use the information from a single sensory channel to make a decision. And in this case, the sort of active channel or the channel being used is the one shown in blue. So you could imagine that structurally, you have a multisensory circuit. There are connections from each channel to the outputs, but functionally, you're only using the information from one channel at a time. So this is essentially the same as just having like a unisensory observer. In the middle are what are called two-look algorithms, in which the information from each sensory channel is used to make an independent decision, which in this case is showed by the filled blue dot. So you take the information from channel 0, you make a decision. You take the information from channel 1, you make a decision. And then at your output, you have to have some function for deciding between these. So for example, if you imagine the channels having different speeds of information flow, then maybe the output of the whole circuit is whichever channel is fastest. Or if the channels will have different reliability, you could choose the channel which is more reliable for that particular task. But the idea is basically you use in each channel to make an independent decision, and then you make some sort of meta decision based on those two decisions. Then finally, at the other end of this sort of algorithmic spectrum are what are called fusion algorithms, in which you combine or fuse the sensory information across channels, and then you use that combined output to make your decisions. And this is what we would usually think about when we think about a multisensory circuit. And in the literature, it's these neurons in the middle, which we'd normally think about as sort of multisensory neurons. So these are neurons which sit between unisensory inputs, like visual cortex, auditory cortex, and motor outputs. So these are what we'd normally think about as multisensory neurons. And in these algorithms, we can think about this fusion step, so the function implemented by the multimodal neurons, as being either linear, in which case the multimodal neuron activity reflects the sum of their inputs, or we could think about that as being a nonlinear function. So essentially, the multimodal neurons would compute some nonlinear function of their inputs, which they then pass to their outputs. So which of these algorithms best describes multisensory processing in animal models? Somewhat surprisingly, experimental studies in both primates and monkeys, and also some human behavioral studies, support the idea that the sort of function implemented is linear fusion. And what I mean by that is that the behavior of animals or observers in these different types of multisensory tasks seems to approximate linear fusion. And also, if you record from multisensory neurons, in this most recent paper, for example, Cohen et al. 2023, they used neuropixels to record from tens of thousands of neurons in mice. They then fit linear and nonlinear models to the neural activity. And they show that these linear models are the best fit for the activity of the multisensory neurons. So essentially where we are in the literature, to my mind, is that experimental studies support linear fusion as a good description of multisensory processing. However, to my mind, or to our mind, this kind of conclusion raises a couple of questions. One of those is how strongly does this conclusion depend on the kind of tasks which the animals are solving in these studies? Or phrased differently, does linear fusion generalize as an optimal algorithm to other types of multisensory tasks? And then the second question is that in studies which have recorded from multisensory neurons outside of task context, so often just passive recording studies, they've actually quite often seen that multisensory neurons seem to have nonlinear functions of their activity. So if you're passively recording from a multisensory neuron, you present a multimodal stimulus, its activity is quite often greater than the sum of those two individual inputs would be. And so sort of another question is like, what role do neurons with nonlinear multimodal responses play if we think that the optimal algorithm is linear fusion? So yeah, to approach this question, these questions, we designed a family of related tasks for observers to perform, and I'll explain the observers on the next slide. But in these tasks, what we do is we present sequences of information over time in multiple channels. So for example, here is what we would call a trial, and this trial is composed of 9 time points. So each of these is one time point in the trial. And you can see that there's information in 2 channels which goes across time. So for example, at the first time point here, channel 0 signals left, while channel 1 signals right. At the second time point, channel 0 signals right, and channel 1 is just neutral or doesn't provide any information. We then present these trials to different observers, which is on the next slide. And then the observers have to make a decision, which in this case is about left or right. So the observer observes a sequence of these stimuli over time, and then has to make a decision, in this case, just left or right. Yeah, so across the talk, we'll cover kind of a whole family of these types of tasks, but they all share like two general properties. One is the bias in one direction or the other. And the second is the amount of coincidence, which we define as when both channels signal the same direction simultaneously. So in this trial, the last time step is what we'd call a left coincidence, right? Both channels signal left simultaneously. And if we think about the bias and coincidence for this 9 time step trial, hopefully you can see that there's more information to the left. There's more bias to the left. Well, yeah, there's more information to the left. So there's a bias to the left. And there's also more left coincidence than right coincidence. Actually, in this example, there's no coincidence to the right. Okay, so this is the sort of general task setup. And then using this task, these sorts of tasks, we study the behavior of different types of observers in them. And what we use is 3 types of observer. We use ideal Bayesian algorithms, which are map estimators. We use artificial neural networks and spiking neural networks. And just because spiking neural networks are maybe a little bit exotic in this context, spiking neural networks are just a type of artificial neural network in which we model each unit in the network using a leaky integrate and fire model. So like the video shows, each unit integrates its inputs over time. When that crosses a threshold, the units spike and then reset. And that means that ignoring the weights, there's basically, neurons output binary information to units in successive layers. So how can we train those networks of leaky integrate and fire units to solve tasks? A really nice solution for this is a method called surrogate gradient descent, which was published by Friedman and Zenk. And essentially, it's like a little adaptation trick, which allows us to use backpropagation to train networks of leaky integrate and fire units to solve tasks. So that's what we do here. When we're working with spiking neural networks in the project, in the talk, we're going to be comparing 3 architectures. A multimodal architecture, which is like the fusion architecture I showed earlier. And then one architecture in which we just remove that multimodal layer, which we're going to call a unimodal architecture. And then to control for network depth, because obviously this unimodal architecture has 1 layer fewer than this, what we call a 2-layer unimodal architecture, where we have successive layers of unimodal units. Yeah, and there's 2 things to note here. So one is that we balance the number of trainable parameters. So actually all 3 of these architectures have the same number of trainable parameters. And the second is that all of the units in these models are leaky integrate and fire units, apart from the units at the end, which are the decision readouts. These are leaky integrate units. So they integrate information over time with a leak, but they never hit a threshold. It's for a kind of technical reason, it's just easier to train with surrogate gradient descent when the setup is that way. But it does have like a very practical implication here, which is that the unimodal architectures essentially approximate what I described earlier as linear fusion, i.e. the step in the network architecture at which information is fused across channels is linear in these top 2 architectures, whereas in the multimodal case, this function is nonlinear. So because these are essentially in the multimodal architecture, the sort of unisensory information is fused by spiking units with a threshold that this becomes nonlinear. So, we can describe this in terms of architectures, but we can also think of this as just linear fusion, top 2 versus nonlinear fusion in green. Hopefully that's clear. Yeah, okay. Okay, so with the setup, we then started by considering the classical tasks which have been used in multisensory studies like this in the literature. And in these tasks, the observers are presented with sequences of these like directional cues over time, and then have to make a decision. And in these tasks, the label or the correct decision just depends on the bias. So in this case here, you can just see that there's more information to the left overall. And so if the observer was presented with this trial, and like when we train them, the correct decision for this sequence is left. So we trained our three spiking neural network architectures on this task. And this plot on the far side shows their results on an unseen test data set. So here, the x-axis is time within the trial. So instead of using trials with 9 time steps, we use trials with 90 time steps. And then the y-axis shows how accurately can we decode the choice from the decision readout at every time step. So obviously at time step 0, the networks have had no information, or just one time step of information. And so they just guess at 50%. They just guess left, right. And then across the trial, they accumulate evidence about the correct direction. And you see these nice sort of curves. Yep.
So what would be a correct choice, for example, in the first case where channel 0 is pointing to one direction and channel 1 is pointing to the other?
Yeah, it's a good question. So there's kind of two sets of, the reason this is classical tasks with an S is because this has been set up differently in the literature in like 2 main ways. So in one case, which is the case I'm showing here, the 2 channels always agree on the direction. So like there's a bias to the left in channel 0 and a bias to the left in channel 1. Yeah, so the correct label comes from the whole 90 time steps. But there's also like an extended version of this task where you have the channels disagreeing on the direction. So like maybe channel 0 indicates left and channel 1 indicates right. We also, it's in the supplement for the paper, we also train on, so in this case, we're just training on these agreeing trials. In the supplement, we train on a task which actually has like 5 subtasks, which are 2 of those are like unisensory. So you just get noise in one channel and information in the other. So that's 2 unisensory tasks, an agreeing task where they both agree, and then what we call conflict trials where they disagree. And in that case, what we do is the label is the channel which has a stronger bias, basically. So for example, if channel 0 indicates left on 70 time steps and channel 1 indicates right on only 50 time steps, we'd say the correct label is left. No, it doesn't come up in the talk. In the paper, there's also like another type of that sort of conflict trial you could have, which is where the sort of bias differs from the label you'd get from the coincidences as well. We also consider that case in the paper. So that would be where overall there's a bias towards the left, but whenever you observe coincidences, they tend to be in the opposite direction. We consider all sorts of variations of this in the paper, basically. Okay, so we get these accuracy over time curves. And hopefully, as you can see, there's like no difference between any of these 3 architectures. And there's no difference in like overall accuracy or also reaction speed. Like all the curves accumulate evidence at a similar rate. So what this suggests is that like nonlinear fusion is not necessary for accuracy or balancing speed and accuracy in these classical tasks. So essentially, linear fusion is optimal for the tasks which people have previously looked at in the literature. So that led us to think about like, what task would nonlinear fusion be critical for? That led us to design a variation on this classical task, in which now we generate trials with 2 properties by co-modulating the signals across channels. So now we generate trials in which there's no bias to the left or the right in either channel. So for example, if you look at channel 0 and you count the number of lefts, there's 3 lefts, 3 rights, 3 neutrals, and the same is true in channel 1. But now there's a bias in the coincidences. So now whenever you observe a coincidence in this case, it's always to the left. And you can actually vary this parameter for the task. You can basically vary the ratio of left to right coincidences for the task as well to make the task more or less difficult. So so essentially in this task, there's no bias, but the coincidences are informative. Again, we train and test all 3 of our architectures on this task. And now the result we see is very different. So now both of the unimodal architectures, which are shown in purple, just remain at chance performance. They can't learn this task at all. Whereas the multimodal architecture in green approaches ideal performance, which is shown in gray. And that's the ideal Bayesian estimator in gray. Yep.
This is the fact that a person can learn the XOR task.
Yeah, it's also related to universal function approximation. So like networks with linear activations can't learn any function, whereas networks with a nonlinear function can learn any function. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and you can also think of this as like a temporal. I can never get this quite right. There is like one of these logic tasks which you can think of this as a temporal version of. Yeah, I can't remember right now. But yeah, it is like a temporal version of something like XOR. Okay, so these are the results we have. Why do we have these results? Or why is this the case? Yeah, well, essentially all of our architectures have these like linear readouts at the end of the architecture. So all of them can perform linear fusion and detect bias, which means that they can solve these sorts of classical tasks which have been done in the literature. In contrast, having this nonlinear fusion step, which the multisensory layer provides, allows networks to detect both bias and coincidence. And what that means is that they can solve this type of co-modulation task where there's just coincident information. But both of these tasks seem kind of unplausible or unrealistic, and they just seem kind of like laboratory tasks, because in this case, just bias is informative, and in this case, just coincidence is informative. And what we really wanted to consider was like a more naturalistic case where you would get some information from bias and some information from coincidence. So to do that, we adapted these prior tasks to produce a new task, which we call a detection task. And it's a little bit like the scenario I described earlier, where we think about a predator looking for prey in a bush. So this figure at the top shows how we generate trials in this task. Now we think of the observer, the neural network, the Bayesian model as a predator. And then on some trials, there's no prey. So that's when m equals 0 up here. On other trials, there's prey present, and the prey moves either left or right. And that's when m equals L or R there. Then, at some time steps, the prey remain hidden. So they don't provide any clues about their direction of motion. And that's this gray pathway at the top when ET equals 0. And when the prey are hidden or not present, you get stimuli like this shown on the end with the gray bar where E equals 0, which means you just get an equal amount of information in either direction. So essentially, when the prey are absent, you just get noise. And when the prey are present but hidden, you also just get noise. What's different is that there's other times when ET equals 1, in which the prey emit signals which provide information about their direction of motion. So that's the orange pathway here. And now you basically generate data which gives you both bias and more coincidence in the true direction of the prey's motion. That's this orange period at the end of the trial. So if you didn't follow the model, don't worry too much. In practice, what we end up with is trials which look very much like the other tasks. So they're just sequences of discrete observations in two channels. But now there's this additional challenge that sometimes you have periods of just background noise when E equals 0, and sometimes you have periods of information when E equals 1. So we set this task up using a probabilistic model, which has 5 parameters. And what we wanted to do was to explore the impact of these parameters on the difference between linear and nonlinear fusion. So in other words, how does linear fusion compare to nonlinear fusion as we vary all of these parameters? So we did that by randomly sampling thousands of parameter combinations and then calculating the difference in accuracy between the two algorithms using our ideal Bayesian observers. So what I'm showing here, we're just going to focus on 2 of the parameters which are most important for this difference, which are PE and PC. And then what I'm showing is on the x-axis is the value of each parameter. And then on the y-axis is the difference in accuracy, and it's nonlinear fusion minus linear fusion. So when it's positive, nonlinear fusion is performing better. So what we found is that nonlinear fusion always performs better than linear fusion. So this difference is always positive, and that's actually by definition. And then the difference can actually be quite large. So in this case, we see up to 15% difference in accuracy, depending on the parameter sets. Interestingly, this difference is largest when PE, this first parameter, is low, which is the probability the prey emits signals. And the difference is also largest when PC is high, which is the probability that prey provide reliable information about the direction of motion. So it's the probability that if the prey is moving left, it provides left signals compared to right signals. What we think is kind of cool about this is that this resembles what we would think of as naturalistic conditions, in which prey provide reliable cues about their direction of motion, but try to minimize how many cues they give to predators by remaining as hidden as possible. So in other words, just the way stimuli work, PCs should be high in natural settings. Like if I'm moving left, I should give off cues which indicate I'm moving left. And if I'm a prey hiding from a predator, I should try to keep PE low. I should try to remain hidden and emit cues sparsely in time. To look at this in a little bit more detail, we basically identified a subset of these settings in which we vary both PE and PC, the two most important parameters. That's what's shown on this axis, which we now term the signal sparsity. And yeah, essentially across this set of the parameters, nonlinear fusion's performance remains fixed at 80%, and linear fusion's accuracy decays as a function of this. So essentially, as the signal becomes sparser in time, then linear fusion, you see a bigger difference between nonlinear and linear fusion. So essentially, in dense cases, you see very little difference between the two algorithms, whereas as the signal from the prey becomes sparser in time, you see a bigger and bigger difference between the two algorithms. Yep.
Sorry, the signal sparsity, the combination of these two factors.
Yes.
Is that a combination about to what degree it emits, and if it does do something, how you can detect
Yeah, so it's a combination of PE, which is how often they emit signals, and then also PC, which is when they do emit signals, how reliable are those signals? So this axis is something, it's maybe better labeled as something as like the sparsity of the true signal.
Got it.
Yep. Which was also something the reviewer pointed out, which I have not updated on this slide. So yeah. Yeah, okay. So then we basically just took these two extremes of these subset, which we're going to call dense and sparse detection, and trained our spiking neural networks on these two settings for this task. And what we show kind of just confirms the results from the Bayesian models. So in the dense case, we don't see any difference between the two algorithms. All of them perform equivalently. Whereas in the sparse case, now the unimodal architectures, because there's some bias, this is a task which they can perform to some level. So their performance goes to like maybe 55%. This is now a three-way classification task, so baseline performance is like 33%. But what you can see is that having nonlinear fusion, which is afforded by the multimodal architecture, gives you this big boost in accuracy, basically. So this was the sort of task which we were looking for. In the paper, if you're interested in more details than this, I realize this is maybe quite detailed. We show that this is also true in the more general case of n channels and also n or continuous directions. So instead of just thinking about two channels and left or right, we in the paper show that this is the case for essentially all combinations of directions and channels, and also instead of just discrete directions, left or right, for continuous directions. Okay, so just to summarize what I've shown you so far, we've considered three types of tasks in which there's various amounts of bias and coincidence. I've shown you that linear fusion, which is the kind of, I don't know, predominant view or main view in the literature, is optimal for this classical task, but starts to perform suboptimally on this detection task, and then actually fails completely in this co-modulation task. Whereas I've shown you that nonlinear fusion is actually optimal for all of these settings, and as I alluded to, also the more general case of n channels and n or continuous directions. So just before I move on to the second part of the talk, just to sort of summarize this question, the question I raised was like, what algorithm best describes multisensory processing in biological systems? Previous experimental work suggests that linear fusion is a good description, whereas our results kind of support the idea that nonlinear fusion could be a better description. Clearly, we can't resolve this question without more experimental work, but despite that, I'm going to make the case that nonlinear fusion is a better description, and that's for three reasons. The first is that the two algorithms perform equivalently on the classical tasks which have been done in the literature. And what that really means is that actually prior experimental results at the behavioral level are consistent with either algorithm. The second is that on our new task, linear fusion performs suboptimally or even fails. And so if we think of these tasks as being ecologically relevant, or tasks with these types of relations between channels as being ecologically relevant, then we would assume that animals would want to perform better, or would benefit from performing better. The other point here is that actually some of these tasks constitute really simple experiments. So for example, if you have an animal and it's able to perform our co-modulation task, then it must be implementing nonlinear fusion. So we're in the process of collaborating with some experimentalists on trying those tasks at the minute. And then the final point is sort of more a hardware point, which is just that neurons are inherently nonlinear. They use spiking nonlinearity to transform their inputs. So to some extent, nonlinear fusion represents a more natural solution. And the other point, which we explore a lot more in the paper, is that when we train spiking neural networks or networks of leaky integrating fire to do these tasks, they find this solution, which kind of supports the idea that this might be like a reasonable solution for networks of leaky integrated fire neurons, at least. Okay, just before I go on to the next part of the talk, which is going to be on multisensory architectures, are there any questions?
Which is about different models that
you're using.
So I'm not fully familiar with all of them, but is there a difference in complexity? So if we talk about parameters or
yeah, so when we specify these as like the Bayesian algorithms, like the map estimators, linear fusion in this case with 2 channels and 2 directions has 6 parameters, and nonlinear fusion has 9, basically. But what we show in the paper as well, deep in the mathematical appendix, is that as you increase the number of channels and directions, this actually grows very favorably. So the model complexity for nonlinear fusion goes very favorably with those 2 terms. So it doesn't grow, it doesn't explode in complexity, basically. Yep.
I have a bit of an ethological question, basically.
Sure.
So, I mean, what is the setup in biology that this would be useful, like a very concrete experiment that you might want to compare this to? So is it like a binary choice, or is it more like, you know, that you can't chase animals by a predator somehow?
Yeah, so the kind of tasks which we're sort of approximating with what we call the sort of classical task here is along the lines of like you give some sort of visual stimulus which provides directional information over time. So like, for example, people have done moving gratings or random dots. And then in the audio channel, people quite often just do something simple like a louder noise on the left and the right. So it's these types of tasks which people have done before. And kind of the difference with previous tasks is that in the classical tasks, these 2 channels are independent, whereas what we've now introduced is these tasks in which they are conditionally independent given an underlying variable and another variable too. That's the main difference between the tasks, I think. Yep.
That's very quick to catch up with that. So the thing is, for tasks like, so these are the decision-making like tasks.
Yep.
Or will also apply for recognition if there's something different, because recognition and decision-making will be just kind of the same thing. But do you think they apply for both?
I'm not sure. I think, yeah, I mean, so the tasks we focus on this paper are these like evidence accumulation tasks, which are like very lab-based. I'm not sure how it would extend to like other types of tasks, but actually in the second part of the talk, we're sort of moving on to thinking about even more tasks, basically. So maybe that will answer your question. Cool. Yeah, okay, so let's move on. So far for all of the tasks which we've considered, which has been quite a lot of different types of tasks, this feed-forward architecture has been optimal, right? Like we just need to take the information from the separate sensory channels and pass it forward. But kind of somewhat unsurprisingly, what connectomic studies in different species have revealed is that, you know, real biological circuits look nothing like this. And they're actually full of all these kind of complicated connection types, like skip connections, which bypass certain layers in the circuit. This 2015 paper is a really cool paper in Drosophila larvae, which finds these types of skip connections in Drosophila larvae, which I think is really amazing. Like if the fly maggots need these types of connections, like shortly. Yeah, anyway. And then, yeah, so there's all sorts of connection types in these circuits in reality, like skip connections. And also somewhat surprisingly, I think there's actually lots of these feedback connections, which go from multisensory areas back to what we normally think about as unisensory areas, which kind of helps shake up our definitions of like what we think of in the brain as like unisensory neurons. So in this part of the talk, we're going to consider what tasks require these more complex network topologies. And a question to sort of also keep in mind is like, what makes a better network? So, you know, maybe these two networks perform equivalently on some task, but maybe one is better in terms of energy costs or robustness to noise, etc. For example, in machine learning, there's some quite convincing evidence that having skip connections maybe doesn't necessarily improve your performance at the end of training, but lets you learn quicker. Okay, so to approach this, we're obviously going to need more complicated tasks. So the sort of guess we took was switching to navigation style tasks in which we have agents which basically implement this sort of three-step process. So they sense their environment, they implement a policy, and then they take actions in their environment in a loop. And yeah, what do I mean by policy? A policy here could be an algorithm, like the algorithms I introduced at the start of the talk, or it could be a neural network. And obviously you could train that with like backpropagation, reinforcement learning, like whatever. The other thing to add is that in most cases, which I'll show, we're going to add time-varying noise to their sensors. So the sort of stimuli which the agents receive will be a static property of the environment, but the sensors have time-varying noise. Okay, so with the setup, let's just start by thinking about like a really simple task, which is kind of like a sort of task you might see in experimental neuroscience. So here we have an agent which starts in the middle of a linear track, and it has to navigate to one end of that track, which is marked with an E in this case. How does the agent know which way to go? We provide information in two channels. In this case, channel 0 provides an ascending gradient in the correct direction, while channel 1 is ambiguous. So there's a gradient in each, there's an equal gradient in each direction. So in this case, following channel 0 would take you to the goal, whereas following channel 1 wouldn't tell you which way to go. So obviously this task seems a bit trivial, but what we do is we test agents over a batch of these environments where we flip which side E is on. In other words, going left or right isn't always the correct solution. And then we also flip which channel is ambiguous across trials. So what that means is that it's only by using information from both channels across trials that you can perform optimally. So even though this part of the talk is meant to be on network architectures, we're just going to start by thinking about how some agents which follow the algorithms I showed earlier perform on this simple task. So this graph shows each agent's performance, which we're going to call fitness for a reason which will become clear in a minute, on this task. That's the y-axis, as a function of increasing sensor noise. So if you ignore the information from both channels and just move around randomly, obviously you get very low fitness, and that's the blue line here. And obviously if you're ignoring information from both channels, your fitness doesn't change as a function of sensor noise. If you use the information from one channel and ignore the other one, you get fitness which starts around 0.7 and then decays as a function of noise. And then finally, if you use linear or nonlinear fusion in this case, you perform optimally, and those are the yellow and orange curves here. So the kind of question is like, how can we change this simple task to see a bigger difference between these algorithms or to sort of break some of them? One way, which is sort of following on from the first part of the talk, is that we can introduce a nonlinearity to the sensory stimuli. And in this case, you now see a much bigger separation between the algorithms. So again, if you ignore the information, your fitness just remains constant as a function of noise. That's the blue line. But now actually some of the algorithms perform below chance. That is, they always take the wrong decision in the case of no noise. That's these sort of orange ones down here. Linear fusion performs somewhere in the middle. The orange line is like somewhere around 0.5 and decays down. And only nonlinear fusion is optimal in this case. So to be honest with you, this is kind of just the first part of the talk. So what's like another way in which we can edit this first maze on the left, but this to break all of the algorithms? One really simple change is that we can just introduce a sensory gap. So if you imagine being the agent, you start in the middle, you sense some stimuli to your left, but more stimuli to your right. So you set off going right. And then suddenly you reach a point at which there's no sensory information in front of you, but there's sensory information behind you. So like what type of agents can actually solve that task? It turns out that actually none of these optimal algorithms can do this task at all. And I really like this example because even though it's a really simple task and a really simple change, it just shows you that these optimal algorithms are really quite brittle when you start thinking about potentially more realistic tasks. Okay, so now we have a sort of reasonable-ish task. How can we search for an alternative architecture or algorithm which could solve a task like this? There's lots of potential solutions, and I'm sure everyone has their own ideas. But one way is to use an evolutionary algorithm, which lets you evolve neural network architectures. And one of those is the NEAT algorithm, which was first published in 2002. This works in 4 quite simple steps. So first, we initialize a population of architectures. So all of these networks have the same input sensors and output actions, but essentially they differ in their connectivity. So like, for example, this network has 1 positive and 1 negative connection. Another one might have 3 positive connections, etc. Sorry. We then evaluate these architectures over a batch of trials, like this maze I've just shown, and we rank them by their performance. So in this case, you can see that this architecture with 4 positive connections was the best. And at the end of this stack would be maybe an architecture with no connections, right? That would just behave randomly. What we then do is we create a new population of architectures by varying the best architectures. And then we repeat this loop from steps 2 to 4 until we have a solution to the task. NEAT lets you control how you vary the architectures. And what I'm doing here is allowing it to add connections, remove connections, and also add nodes and remove nodes. And those connections can be both forwards or backwards. So in this example here, we add 1 hidden node to the network, and then we also add a backwards inhibitory connection. That's the type of variation which you could expect from the way I've set the algorithm up. Okay, so if we apply this process to the sort of simple version of the task I showed earlier, it should be kind of unsurprising-ish that we just get a very simple architecture. So how to sort of read this architecture diagram. On the left are the 4 different input sensors. So there's 2 per channel in each direction. So there's sensors to the left in each channel, sensors to the right in each channel. And then on the other side of the figure, there's so much left and right. Maybe I should move that up and down. But yeah, on the right-hand side of the screen are the outputs for the network, which in this case are just move left, move right. And obviously, the way this task is set up, the optimal algorithm is just to have positive weights connecting these, right? So now, if we move on to this like more complicated task with the gap, like what are the architectures which could solve that task? I'll actually throw that to the audience. Can anyone think of like small variations on this architecture which would allow it to solve this task? Yeah, someone said recurrence. Yeah, so recurrence is one of the solutions. So like we can just put recurrent connections on the output units, positive. So that means if you go left, or whatever the left activation is, you'll be more likely to go left again with the next step. Can anyone else think of like another small variation we could have? Yeah, time delays would be one. So actually, yeah, time delays is the solution. I was going to say, so we don't actually, it's an interesting point that we don't actually have like, we could add like trainable delays or learnable delays to the network. We don't have that, but actually the way the neuron model works is like the information doesn't propagate through the network instantly. It does propagate over time. So in this case, you can actually, by just adding this hidden layer with 2 neurons, you can actually add a delay. So like if we just follow this top triangle, like the activity of the right output unit, meaning to go right, that gets information at time t from the input, and it also gets information from that input at time t minus 1, right? So like its activation at any time step t is a function of both its current input and its input at the previous time step. So this is one way. Essentially, this layering lets you have time delays in the network. There's also other solutions. For example, if you remove this this part of the triangle and you put like a feedback connection here, you also get the same thing. So in that case, having this reciprocal connection also lets you solve the task. The other thing to note is that like there's also no reason for these to be symmetrical. Like I've just chosen symmetrical examples. And we also see in between things where like maybe for the left, you have like this triangle, and for the right, you have a recurrent connection, etc. But you could also think about these, if you sort of thought about these in terms of costs, like this one on the left just involves adding 2 connections. This one on the right involves adding 2 hidden nodes and more connections. Okay, so something which I was going to gloss over in the talk, but I sort of thought you guys would probably be interested in, is like how you actually end up choosing these examples, I guess. So yeah, something I've glossed over is that when you use an evolutionary algorithm, you don't just get one solution like I've shown you, like the recurrence or the triangle thing. You actually get like hundreds or thousands of solutions depending on how you run the algorithm. So when you evolve it for a single task, like task A, you end up with this whole batch of solutions. And then that's the same for task B as well. So you have like hundreds to thousands of solutions for each task. And what you'd like to do is have some sort of principled or quantitative way of comparing the topologies between these 2 cases and saying like, you know, now I've changed the task in a specific way, it changes the topology in a particular way. So in a simple case, like going from this like no gap to having the gap, now we should see like an increase in recurrence, right? So to do that, I've just done this very simple thing for now, which is that when you have 2 tasks, I basically get all the networks which perform the task to some level of accuracy. So here, like 95%. And then I compute a load of graph metrics on those graphs, and then make statistical comparisons between the 2 tasks. So in this case, the gray is the sort of track maze task, and then the blue is the task with the gap. And I've split the metrics up into 2 types. One type are just ones which can take values greater than 1, and the other type are ones which are always bounded between 0 and 1. And then I've sorted the metrics by how well they can be used by a classifier to distinguish between the 2 groups. So basically, when you're more on the left, these features are more different compared to ones further on the right. Confusingly, that's then true within each plot as well. So to get the optimal order of features, you have to sort of jump between the plots. It doesn't matter too much. Essentially, intuitively in this case, you can see that like you get more hidden units in this gap maze task because we might add those like triangle motifs we talked about. You get more edges in this gap task because you might add recurrent connections, you might add connections to this hidden layer. And then also you can capture that using kind of graph metrics, like for example, C3G is the transitivity of the graph. And actually kind of interestingly, that captures the triangle motifs I was just talking about, right? So where's my mouse? Anyway, transitivity, right, is like if you're this channel 1 input, channel 1R, and you connect to both the act right output and that hidden node, the transitivity is like what proportion of nodes of possible triangles in the network exist where that then connects. And you can see that for this case, you actually get this really big increase in this C3 transitivity, which is like 11 times different between the 2 tasks. Obviously, in this case, you can just describe it with something simple like the number of hidden nodes. But in the long term, the idea is to have like more complicated tasks, which demand or lead to more complicated architectures. And then maybe it's like some of these graph metrics will do like a better job at capturing difficult features or like less intuitive features of those networks. So yeah, in the sort of long term, the idea is to have more complicated tasks, which lead to more complicated topologies. And what I've been working on a lot at the minute is what I call general mazes. So here, the idea is to have a maze structure, which is shown here by the white track and the gray walls. Luckily, there's like really good algorithms for generating mazes. So I can easily generate like 1,000 unique mazes. In these mazes, the idea is just to have a start and an end point. Those could be anywhere, but I just choose the corners. They're shown by the green circles. And then in this case, you can see the shortest path through the maze follows this like blue to red trajectory. So yeah, so essentially it's relatively easy to generate mazes with different structures and different sort of topologies. But then this kind of more challenging question is like, how do you add sensory information to these mazes in ways which drives the evolution of more complicated architectures? That's not so intuitive. And so what I'm currently exploring is like different ways of filling this sensory information in to then drive the evolution of these architectures. So just to give you like one example of that, this graph is very difficult to read, but it's, a work in progress. So basically at every point in the maze, there's a full circle. The left hemisphere shows the information in one sensory channel, with darker being more sensory information, like the gradients we talked about. And then the other hemisphere, the right hemisphere, shows the information from the other channel. In this case, I filled in the left channel, or the channel 0, with just the shortest path. So essentially, if you just follow the left channel in the absence of noise, it's a gradient just going from this green circle to the end of the maze. So that channel gives you information about the shortest path through the maze. And then the other channel gives you another distance metric from every point to the end of the maze. Here it's what's called the chessboard distance, which is basically you take the distance in X and Y and then take the maximum of that distance. So the idea here is that like on its own, the shortest path is the best solution. On its own, the chess path distance is more useful than using no information. But then in the presence of noise and like varying how much you get from these two channels, there's like a multisensory strategy, which is optimal. And yeah, I'm just sort of playing around with how you compute these functions, basically. Yeah, okay. So just to sort of, I don't have very strong conclusions for this part of the talk, but I guess just to summarize it, feedforward architectures are optimal for many prior multisensory tasks, like all of the tasks which I showed in the first half of the talk. Multisensory circuits are not feedforward. They have all sorts of complicated connections. I'd like to try and think about why or what role these complex connections have. And I think that moving to these like embedded tasks in which you have agents in environments, and then using evolutionary algorithms to explore alternative architectures, which we can also think about as algorithms, seems like a kind of promising or at least fun direction. Yeah, so with that, I'd like to thank my co-authors for the first part of the talk, Gabriel Benner and Dan Goodman at Imperial and Volker Bormuth at Sorbonne. And yeah, then I'd just like to say, if you have any questions, you can read the preprint for the first half of the talk, which is on bioRxiv. You can email me with my email address, or I'm happy to take any questions you have now as well. So yeah, thanks for listening.